everyone, Clio here, and today I'm coming at you with another All the Time in the World TBR video. So the idea is just that I'm going to be going through 10 books that if I had enough time I would be getting around to. I did this previously for fantasy series, so basically like if I was given all the time and the money in the world at this point in time, which would be the 10 series that I want to dive into, I will link that video up there, but I will also do it today for rereads. You know, rereading is often a little bit of a double-edged sword. You know, you want to be getting around to rereading some of your favorites or rereading some books that you really loved in the past, but you don't really know for sure whether they would still hold up at this point in time because your reading preferences have changed a little bit, for example. Or, you know, you read them when you were still young and you don't know whether now that you've read so many more books, these still hold up as favorites. But on the other hand, there are so many unread books on your shelves, or there are so many unread books that you have an eye on, so it's always difficult to balance the two. And so I want to be kind of going over, like, if I had all the time in the world and I had all the time I could spare to read both new books and rereads, which would be the rereads that I would be getting around to in that case. Now, as I did in the video about fantasy, I am going to be going through the 10 most, the 10 highest priorities for me in terms of a reread. First off for this one is going to be a more or less unknown book to most of you, and that is His Bloody Project by Graeme, Macrae, Burnett. So this is a book that was nominated or shortlisted even for the Booker Prize. In 2016 it seems, and I don't know whether I read it that year or whether I read it later, but I absolutely love this one. And it's quite weird because it's a genre that I don't actually like, but I know it's going to be a little bit different than your typical book within that genre because it was nominated. So this is actually a sort of mystery thriller, a courtroom drama, so to speak. So it is dealing with this guy living in a remote community in the Scottish Highlands who is accused of having committed a crime. So it's a pretty straightforward concept to it, but there must be something special about it, something particular, because it really stood out to me that year. It really was one of my favorite reads, and years later I still remember that I absolutely loved that book when I read it, but I don't really know a lot anymore or anything anymore about what happened within this book or what, you know, what made it special, why I loved it so much. So it is one that I really want to reread, but it's also one that is low on priority in terms of my reading year. So I'm pretty damn sure 2021 it will still not get reread. It's probably maybe in my 90s I will be like, I still need to reread this book because yeah, it's just I'm just never prioritizing this reread. So yeah, I don't know, but if I had all the time in the world, I would definitely reread this book. Next up is a fantasy book, and it actually is a tie-in with the fantasy version that I did of this tag, because this is Daughter of the Empire by Raymond E. Feist and Janny Wurts. This is the first book in the Empire trilogy, and this is a series that is closely tied to Raymond E. Feist's Rift War saga. So the Rift War saga and the Empire trilogy are closely tied. They are set within the same universe, within the same world, and actually a character that is part of the world from Rift War saga makes his way into the Empire trilogy at some point within this story. It is a fantasy story that I read when I was a teenager and that I absolutely fell in love with. So we are following our protagonist called Mada, and this society is very much a society built on hierarchy, built on the caste system, and within this you have these sort of big houses that are vying for power. It's very much a political centered fantasy. It's heavy on political intrigue, and so at the beginning of this book Mada is the heir to her house because her father and her brother have just been brutally slaughtered in a sort of political play by one of her enemy houses. And so this book will see her trying to survive, trying to keep her house afloat, trying to maneuver the politics of this world that she was actually never really trained for in order to help her house survive and maybe even further her house's standing. Absolutely love this one. Strong female character. I will have to say that there is a trigger warning that I remember for book 1 because there is domestic abuse within this story, and I mean it's only there in the first one I think, but there are some very hard-hitting scenes within that first book in terms of that trigger warning. But so yeah, I definitely want to reread it at some point. I have already reread this a few times in the past, but I do want to reread it at some point because it's just one that has a special place in my heart and that I want to go back to from time to time. Next up we have one that I actually don't physically own, and that is 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. So this, up until recently, was without a doubt my favorite Murakami. It is basically a parallel universe story in which we are following mainly a male character and a female character who are living in parallel universes to one another. And basically, at least for my experience with it, was that you were constantly like hoping for them to be able to cross that divide and to be able to meet one another, because you would feel that they were perfect for each other and that, you know, they just had to meet. I don't remember too much about the particulars of this story, but it is like a lot of other Murakamis. It is one of those like weirder Murakamis, but it is one of those first Murakamis that I read that really made me fall in love with the atmosphere that Murakami manages to evoke within his stories. And so yeah, I definitely want to reread it and see, like, does it hold up or not? Because I have also recently read one of his more like realist pieces of fiction, and that was The Colorless Sakura Taizaki and His Years of Pilgrimage, which is now so near and dear to my heart that I kind of want to make the comparison, you know, I kind of want to have a showdown between these books at some point. Next up, it's time for another fantasy, and this one is actually one that is scheduled for 2021. This is going to happen, and that is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, the first book in the Mistborn trilogy. So it's kind of giving away a little bit of a hint for what is going to come in a later video this month, but it is part of a project that I have going for 2021, in which I'm going to be rereading a couple of Brandon Sandersons. But so The Final Empire is the first book in the Mistborn series, in which we are following, mainly we're following our protagonist called Vin, who is this sort of like street urchin who has always gotten by on her luck. She has this sort of reputation of being lucky and is kind of gotten engrossed with this sort of gang who keeps her around because she is lucky. But at the beginning of this book, she kind of draws negative attention to herself because it turns out that her luck might be something a little bit more than just pure luck. In essence, this is very much a heist plot of the highest level of stakes possible, and you're hopefully gonna love it because it has a huge cast of characters to fall in love with. It has a wonderfully interesting magic system in which metals can be ingested to transform into powers, and you know, it's like, I think it's a great introduction into Brandon Sanderson if you haven't read him before. I've seen some people have difficulties with the beginning of his books, and I will say that Brandon Sanderson always takes his time to set up the world, to set up the characters. For me personally, that is never a problem because I am very much a character-focused reader, but I have seen people say that they've had difficulties going into this one, but I've yet to see, like I haven't seen a whole lot of people who don't end up falling in love with it when it finally picks up, because Brandon Sanderson is very much known for like having the pace of his books explode towards the end of it. Yeah, I have read Mistborn is basically my first Brandon Sanderson that I read. I read it about 10 years ago, reread it about 6 years ago. And about 3 years ago or so is when I finally started to dive into more of his works. And at this point in time, I just want to go back into Mistborn, having had all of the knowledge from some of his other Cosmere books, looking for those connections that might be there, and then diving further into Mistborn Era 2, which I've never read before. Next up, a general fiction one, which is Stoner by John Williams. So in 2021, I'm putting another John Williams on my 12 books for 2021, so that's another sneak peek into a future video. But so I read Stoner for a book club. It was like the first book that we chose for our book club, and it's also the most successful one that we ever chose because everybody loved this one. In terms of story, I don't remember too much except that we are following a sort of university professor nearing the end of his college career, and I just remember it being beautiful, but that is all. And so I know that there wasn't much to the story in itself, so it's very much about the reflections of somebody nearing the end of his career, I guess, and probably a beauty to its writing style, but I would like to re-explore it at some point in time. But so yeah, not really a priority. I have 2 other John Williamses on my shelf which I haven't read yet, which obviously are going to be prioritized over this one. Next one, an absolute favorite, and like possibly my favorite book of all times, but I just don't think you can really say that something is your favorite book. You know, I love certain things in one book, certain things in another. You know, I love certain fantasies so much, but I love this book so much, but on a different level. So I find it difficult to say whether something is a favorite book of all time. It also feels like it's putting so much pressure on the book if you're selling something as your favorite book of all time, and I don't want people to go into a book with that much expectations and then just being disappointed, and then I'll be disappointed if people don't like it. But so that would be Lanny by Max Porter, which is a book told in verse, or not entirely in verse. It's like a more poetical style, and it also has these sort of like moments in which the typography is a little bit different. Basically, it's impossible to sell the story of this book. So we are following a small town in rural UK. It's close to a city because the people within this story is a family that has moved from the city to the countryside, and the father, for example, still does his commute every single day. And it's a lot about like the sort of like small town resentment towards big city folks. It's a lot about us versus them, and looking at these sort of like way in which small communities are like talking about members within its community. And so we are mainly focusing our story on this family itself and their little boy called Lanny, who's a little bit more of a sort of like innocent child still. He's kind of represented as if he is very much still in touch with nature, in touch with his like fairy child. And Lanny strikes up a beautiful friendship with a sort of like grumpy old man within the town who is trying to teach him about art. A very interesting element about this book is also that we have a sort of like magical realism element to it, because we have this sort of supernatural character which kind of represents the nature, or the essence of the town, maybe even, which is Dead Papa Tootwig. And we will get passages in which we are seeing the town through the eyes of Dead Papa Tootwig, and at those points we also often get a sort of like tapestry of the town's voices, and we hear all the things that people are saying to one another within the town, and thus getting a reflection on what is happening within the story from an entire town's perspective. I would highly recommend the audiobook for this one. I haven't physically read it myself yet, so next time I do want to read it alongside with the audiobook, I think, but it is just a full cast audiobook that also uses like sound effects to represent nature, and to give these passages by Dead Papa Tootwig this sort of like magical aspect to them, because there's always nature sounds going on whenever Dead Papa Tootwig is telling his part of the story. Next up is one that I haven't made any sort of decision. It's a book that I read, but I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know whether I liked it, I didn't know whether I loved it, I didn't know whether I understood it. And so it's one that I've been eyeing getting. I've definitely been intrigued about rereading this at some point, and then maybe going into it after having read a few like articles on what people's interpretation of this book is. But so that would be The Vegetarian by Kang, which is a Korean book. It's all about this woman living a sort of like constricted life with her husband, and then she decides to become vegetarian, and there are a lot of opinions about her being vegetarian, but also things become very weird and strange throughout. And I like weird books, but I really couldn't understand too much of this story, and nor did I really feel and nor did I really get a feeling of like, I don't care that I don't know what is going on, I still love it. I really was just so torn on this book, really couldn't decide what my opinion about it is. In 2021 I have put another book by Kang on my 12 books for 2021 as well, so perhaps I can make up my mind about Kang at that point in time, and maybe go back to this one at some point. It is not a priority as most of these books on this list are, but you know, if I ever do want to pick up a reread, then definitely this is one of the contenders. It's also pretty short, so in that sense it's definitely it's definitely accessible for a reread, though I do think it's one of those books that is short, but you need so much of your attention to be put on it that it still takes quite some time to be able to finish it. But so yeah, Maybe one day. Next up we have a Charles Dickens, and that is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. So I am trying to make my way through all of Charles Dickens' works, and so in that sense it is kind of useless to reread them now, because that just makes it even longer before I will have finished all of his works. But I will say that this month I reread Hard Times by Charles Dickens, and it was the first time that I reread a Dickens. And I love that book so much more than I had originally, and so I just want to dive back into some other of his works. I don't think I didn't dislike or feel indifferent to Great Expectations the first time that I read it, but I do remember finding it a lot more difficult to love than some of his other works that I later read. So this is still one of the Dickens that I read before I absolutely fell in love with his writing style. So I wouldn't mind going back into it and figuring out whether, you know, this writing style now fits my taste a lot better, because it is of course one of his greatest novels, one of his most well-known novels, so I definitely do want to go back into it and hopefully fall in love with it this time around. Nearing the end of this list, next up we have a book that I actually did put on a TBR this year, but I didn't get around to rereading it, and that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Before Lanny, this would absolutely have been considered my favorite book of all time, and so I definitely also need to reread it if I'm going to reread Lanny, I guess, because I remember the story for this one, but I don't remember too much of the reason why I absolutely love this one, so I would need to reread it to see whether it holds up or not. So Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier is a book that has been going the rounds recently because it has a new adaptation, though I've heard pretty bad things about it, and so I personally will not be watching the adaptation, the most recent adaptation for this book. And so in this book our protagonist has just married a widower, and they move in together into his mansion called Manderley. This has a famous favorite line, which I will read out to you guys now, but last night I dreamed I went to Manderley again. So it is a line that everybody who has read Rebecca will remember. It kind of sets the mood. It immediately makes me feel that sort of gloomy atmosphere of this book, because in this one we are then looking at our protagonist and the difficulty that she has in establishing herself as the sort of new mistress of Manderley, because she is constantly overshadowed by the ghost of his previous wife Rebecca. Now there's no actual haunting going on, need to clarify that, because I do sometimes see people going into this expecting this type of action within this book, and that is definitely never the case. It's definitely more of a mental situation where our protagonist, whose name we will never know, constantly feels the presence of Rebecca in the way that her husband talks about it, in the way in which this house is decorated, in the way in which the housekeeper will constantly try to reference back to the way in which Rebecca used to do things around the house. So it is very much more of a character-focused story and very much an atmospheric read that has a little bit of that gothic vibe to it. So I definitely want to reread it. I know I loved it so much when I first read it, and I have recently also read My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier and absolutely loved it. So I have no doubt that this book will hold up, but I do want to have it refreshed in my mind. And then the final book that I'm going to be mentioning here is such a big chunker that I don't know whether it's ever going to happen, and that would be War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, which is one of my favorite classics of all time. And yeah, I definitely want to just reread it and recapture that experience and just dive into some aspects of it a little bit more thoroughly. So in War and Peace we are looking at the Napoleonic Wars from a Russian perspective. So we are following mainly Russian aristocracy. It's basically only Russian aristocracy that we were following, though through one of the sort of storylines we do get some glimpses of the way in which this period in time is being lived by, you know, the farmers and things like that. But we are mainly following Russian aristocracy at that time. It's going to be looking at, you know, the love stories, the romance intrigues, the friendships throughout that time. But it is very much more than just that in my experience, because of the fact that we are going in and out of wars, which creates a much more interesting atmosphere, a much more interesting dynamic to the story, as we have our young men going off to war, returning from war, and you have our young women pining over the people that they have left behind. It is also going to go into some of the social commentary of the time. We have some characters in here who are very much intrigued about Marxism, for example, communism, and I absolutely love this. I know it is chunky, and I know that it's quite circular at times, especially in the war sections of this book. There is definitely an argument being made about the way in which history is written down and about how history is written by the winners, and that is an argument that he will expand upon throughout and return to all the time, so it can feel a little bit circular in that sense. But I absolutely love that part of the book. I absolutely love that discussion about history writing from a basically contemporary perspective at the time. And you know, I also love the romance stories within this one, but also like the intrigue between characters, the bad decisions that certain characters make and the repercussions of those decisions and things like that. So absolutely recommend it. Do read it. I know it's such a big chunker, but yeah, I absolutely love it. There is a great miniseries about this. It's a 6-part miniseries, the 2016 version, I think, but it does leave out that entire section about the way in which history is written down, which to me was such a nice discovery within this book. So I would still say that the book is better, but yeah, I mean, I understand if you don't want to dive into this 1,200 page book. But so that is it. Those are the 10 books that I want to reread. If I had all the time in the world, I would definitely make room for all of them to be reread. As it is, I don't know when I'll get around to rereading some of these. I do have plans for a reread for Mistborn Era 1 at least, so at least one of these is getting reread in 2021. But so yeah, see you guys for the next one. Definitely let me know if there are any sort of like books that you keep on meaning to reread but never seem to find the time for, or any book that you might be hesitant to reread because you're afraid it might not hold up. But so yeah, let's discuss it further in the comments, and see you guys for the next one. Bye!